Welcome back to the Business of Biotech, brought to you by Bioprocess Online in partnership with Cytiva. I'm your host, Matt Pillar, and if you've been following along sequentially, you'll know that we just wrapped up a 5-week mini-series featuring the leaders of 5 emerging cell and gene therapy companies. And one of the things all those companies have in common is the fact that they're stepping into a contest that's seemingly being officiated by a newly progressive team of referees, if you will. We might look back on this era and note that this is one in which the FDA has moved and approved at an unprecedented pace. And I'm not just talking about COVID vaccines and Operation Warp Speed. So what is the mindset of this agency, and to what effect on the biopharmaceutical companies that fall under its auspices? That's what we're going to cover today on today's conversation with our friend, Allan Shaw. Allan, it's good to have you back.
Great to see you, Matt. Great to be back.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us. And, you know, the last time we talked, last time you joined us, we enjoyed this wildly meandering conversation about the year that was 2020 and what to expect in 2021. But today we're going to try to tighten up this dialogue a little bit and focus on the regulatory scene. And I guess I'd start with your general observations. I would ask you just how you might characterize, as we sit here, you know, in Q1 2021, how you might characterize or describe the U.S. biopharma regulatory environment.
That's a really interesting question, and I think, you know, your analogy of calling them the referees is important, and you know, I think, you know, sometimes there's a tendency that you know, I guess going back to one of my expressions that I like to use, going back to more of my formative years, you know, why did the auditor cross the road? And I used to tell my staff that's because the auditor did it last year. And I think there's a lot of, you know, regulatory environment is necessarily no different to that. And, you know, I think people are very comfortable and familiar with our time-tested approach to drug approval and the emphasis on safety and protecting patients while trying to advocate innovative medicines. And I think there's a lot of, and I think to the FDA's credit, they have tried to be adaptive. And I think under Scott Gottlieb's regime, I think it was really an enlightened period of time in terms of really trying to focus on some of the things that needed to be done. But I think it's naive to think that, you know, somebody like Scott can come in and with just under 2 years, you know, kind of tear down a Byzantine legacy and invoke innovation that's not going to be overly disruptive and turn things upside down. And I think he made some really great roads there. And I think there's areas where you can really see the FDA being incredibly adaptive in terms of that. And I think no less than what we've just seen in the last 10 months. Yeah. You know, to be able to get a drug approved as quickly and as rapidly, or series of drugs, and it's not even taking into account the development efforts of those companies, which is, again, defines everything, particularly when you're talking about new modalities, which goes beyond anybody's comprehension. So there's a lot there.
Yeah. But just like, if you like even pre-COVID though, I'm curious, like if I look at it just from a number standpoint, and you know, pre-COVID, I wasn't even really in this space, but if I look at, you know, the 2 or 3 years of FDA action prior to the phenomenal work that's been done on the vaccine and approvals and therapeutic approvals there. Just looking at the numbers, it looks as though the pace of approvals and progress on the FDA's part had quickened. Even is that the case? Would you say that is the case?
That is, and as a headline number, I think that is in fact the case. There's nothing can deny that, and there's a lot of things that I think are very encouraging. What I would say is that when you start peeling the onion back on some of those things, you know, I think it tells a story. And, you know, I think when you look at the calls for greater clinical efficiency, particularly as trials become more costly and complex. I think that's something to be mindful of. And the FDA is trying to go through an ongoing modernization efforts to, base regulatory decisions on informed assessment of benefit risk balance. But that also requires a deeper understanding of those risks, as well as a comprehensive assessment of the benefit, as well as, and I think this is an interesting one that perhaps we can come back to later, incorporating the patient's perspectives, their preferences, and even the advocacy groups associated with all of that, which represents a bit of a paradigm in my mind, in a lot of respects. So what do I mean by peeling the onion and taking a closer look at it? Coming back to that. Well, when you look at what's been approved, there's a theme there. There's a high concentration in orphan diseases, and there's a high concentration in oncology. And rightfully so, right? I mean, cancer has impacted all of us, and there's an incredible market there, and it's plagued mankind, because that's been really a death sentence. And what the industry has been doing is really turning it more into a chronic disease. Even there was recent data that came out that suggested the mortality associated with lung cancer has decreased dramatically. Things are happening on all of those fronts. But the point, I guess really the point that I'm trying to draw to is that the concentration of approvals are centered on those two areas. We can look at the numbers. It's over 50%, I believe, and that translates into a couple of things. And I think in the case of orphan diseases, and I think it's analogous to what's going on with oncology, is they're generally much more capital efficient programs to develop. You need smaller clinical sizes. Because the patient groups are smaller, and you're not talking about a primary care product. So therefore, the different types of populations that need to be incorporated in that are different. So therefore, it's a lot less capital intensive. Also, because you're doing smaller trials, it's also saving you on time. So time and money, those are the enemy at the end of the day in biotech. And if you can address those things, and it's also from a marketing perspective, you don't need a major sales force to go after that, because the pricing that you can charge for these products, because of the small markets, are very large. Yeah. So, there's companies that have made businesses off of that, and companies are adapting to that. So the orphan drug program, in my mind, and the success of that orphan drug initiative, when you look at how that generated the proliferation of orphan drugs, shows that how a little bit of regulatory tweaking can go a long way in terms of really addressing a whole bunch of unmet medical needs for a whole set of patient populations. And oncology, I think, offers similar attributes. Because of the unmet medical needs, because you're talking about life and death issues, the risk balance is a little bit different. And I'd say the FDA has demonstrated a much more lenient attitude in terms of oncology thresholds for drug approval. And then further to that, they fit orphan disease characteristics as well. So it's not uncommon that off of phase 2 data, you can potentially get your drug approved with oncology, depending on the level of the data. Yeah. So given, and so therefore, oncology drugs are arguably more capital efficient too, and easy to bring. So when I take a step back and I look at big primary care diseases that affect everybody, things that are cardiovascular, diabetes, neurological, I don't necessarily see or observe as much development in those areas. And I would attribute it to the fact that it's just too costly to develop. Yeah. If you when you have to run big studies. And I think that's the opportunity to figure out how we make those clinical efforts from a regulatory perspective more cost effective, more targeted to patient populations, so we can use real world data and other approaches to bring drugs to market a lot sooner and encourage development, because people are going to go where it's easiest. It's, it's like water. It'll go where the path of least resistance is.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, is, but I guess the analogy that came to my mind was lowest hanging fruit, right? So if there's this focus on orphan drugs and on oncology, because it's the path of least resistance in some cases, is that leaving a gap anywhere in your mind? Like, do you see any unmet patient needs or dire patient needs that are sort of on the back burner because they're more difficult fruits to reach?
I would say that because of that, it certainly doesn't, what I would say is a couple of things on that point. A lot of innovation these days are coming from biotech. And when you're talking about these larger indications, that's a big boy's game. Mm-hmm. You need deeper pockets. So if innovations come out of biotech and the money for those indications is something that you can't realistically take it to yourself, that you really need a partner, it's going to reduce the level of focus and resource allocation to go after that. So, I do think it creates a gap. I think you can probably go down, in terms of a lot of areas where there hasn't been new drug innovation in a lot of different indications for decades. Yeah. And there's an opportunity for that. And I think even Gottlieb has written the fact that, the way the system works right now, once you're first to market, it takes away the incentive for other people to bring other drugs to market. So therefore you can't build better mousetraps. The incentive isn't really there to do it. So, I think there are elements to the system that could be, I think there's an opportunity to learn from what we are doing right in those particular disease modalities or designations that can be applied elsewhere. And I think with technology, with precision medicine, you can address things so that, if you're going to try to project things to the entire population, I think that's the concern. If you're going to do something for cardiovascular, you're testing 20,000 people in a phase 3. You can get a drug approved, orphan disease, on 50 patients or less. Mm-hmm. So, it's different worlds. Yeah. And in cancer, right? Oncology, if you show a response rate of 20%, you can get a drug approved. On the other hand, some people will tell you that the placebo effect is generally 20%. So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of modalities, as you see, we've seen modality advances kind of continue. We're hearing more about the microbiome and exosomes and all sorts of new modalities in the biologic space. As these new modalities advance, do you think the agency is effectively adapting or keeping pace with them, or do you see potential roadblocks there?
It's. I'd say, generally speaking, I would say yes. Mm-hmm. I think with regime changes and with events happening in the environment, I think those can always influence the trajectory and the pace. At the end of the day, and hindsight's always 20/20. And I think as long as there's a feedback loop so we can learn, you're going to always better calibrate as you move forward. But I think it's important that regulatory decisions are flexible and sophisticated as the science that's driving these things evolve. And I think there's a couple of different ways you can contrast where the FDA may go or not go. I think that the speed of the approval process for the messenger RNA products, I think in certain respects speak a little bit about the view of RNAi technology, where there seems to be a higher level of safety associated with it. It seems to be much more on target, wider therapeutic windows. And I contrast that to small molecules, which, each small molecule had its own characteristics. You couldn't necessarily subscribe it across the platform. So I think as you have certain platform technologies, the comfort levels could potentially become easier, and you may be able to lower the bar as you move forward. In contrast, I'd say, the FDA seems to be raising the bar for gene therapy. I think they're putting a lot more emphasis on the manufacturing, and rightfully so. Really, it's a process at the end of the day. Gene therapy is really an engineering exercise, and I think what they're trying to do is get their arms around. To your point, one size does not fit all. It's just a very, very fluid situation. And as we can see in this environment with COVID, we're effectively making up the rules as we go. And it's important that, to use a football analogy, that we understand what the goalposts are. And unfortunately, the goalposts are shifting, and that is a part of the fluidness of the industry. And I think, again, the FDA has done a really nice job of putting out guidance and really are trying to make it easier for companies. But it's fluid. And, I think, the BioMarin non-approval was an eye-opener for people. I think people viewed that as a slam dunk. Mm-hmm. And, they certainly raised the question of durability. And I think, and part of that is in terms of what are your alternative therapeutic options. And I think that factors into it too. And I think it really, again, comes down to risk balance. And I think that's going to be their compass, or at least they're going to attempt to use that as their compass.
The Business of Biotech is brought to you in partnership with Cytiva. Together, we're committed to helping the leaders of new and emerging biopharma companies navigate the financial, organizational, human resources, and regulatory waters you'll encounter on your way from discovery to the clinic and beyond. Check out a host of useful resources for biotech leaders at Cytiva's Emerging Biotech Accelerator at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA lifesciences.com/emerging biotech. Yeah, and I know I want to dig into the gene therapy arena a bit more with you and the regulatory, the regulatory environment there. But so I guess to cue that up, Allan, what's your what's your worldview on gene therapy as it stands today? I'll just throw that out there. It's a big open-ended question.
It's really a wonderful question, and I'm sure if you did a survey, you're going to get different perspectives on people, right? People remember gene therapy of 20 years ago, and with some of the noise that's recently occurred, there's been people going back to the future on those memories a little bit. And I think gene therapy also really represents significant promise. The folk, the gene, the Nobel Prize awards have been recently awarded there. It's moving much more into mainstream, but it's still I think relatively nascent in terms of where we're going on that, on a lot of levels. So I think we're figuring it out, right? We're figuring it out in real time. Yeah. And while there were a couple of products approved in the last couple of years, the FDA has been cautious, and It's understandable, I think. I like to use the Microsoft software as an example, and I've been even thinking of it in the context of the vaccines that are coming out right now. Do you always, I never really tried to get the first version of anything that Microsoft put out.
Yeah. You don't buy the first model year of a new car. You don't get the first version of Microsoft's operating system. Yeah.
So, those are kind of my thoughts. So I think it's still early days and I think we're working it out, but the promise is amazing. It's revolutionary, but I think we have to get the costs down too. I mean, that's a challenge, when I talk to other folks, and try to get their thoughts on how do you manage COGS? How do you increase the number of different shots on goal? And there's different viewpoints. And I think the technologies are different too. And that's evolving, and so, what you might do for one form of delivery in gene therapy might be different for another form of therapy. And now they're talking more about, off the shelf therapies. So, I think as that evolves, I think it'll be easier to police. It's a tough job that the FDA has. No question about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's talk about some of you mentioned the FDA's caution. I'm hoping to get your take on some of the recent missteps, and I know we in kind of planning for this discussion, we wanted to discuss the Sarepta eteplirsen clinical result. So what's your take on that? I know you've shared with me separately that you kind of see this as the highlight of a fundamental scientific disconnect from the agency's prevailing hypothesis that higher dystrophin expression correlated to improved function were, I believe, the words that you use. So tell us what you mean by that and give us your take on it.
No, certainly, kind of looking ahead, I don't think anyone has a crystal ball, but if you're trying to kind of anticipate the next interesting litmus test for the FDA, I think it's the Biogen fast approaching PDUFA date for their Alzheimer's drug. Mm-hmm. And that's scheduled in March. And it was also similar to the Sarepta drug that you referenced. It was rejected by the AdCom committee prior to going to for final approval or rejection.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring that up is what really triggered me to focus on this as an interesting upcoming event was the recent setback that Sarepta had with their gene therapy product, which not only set that program back and maybe their entire pipeline, but I'm not as well versed to speak to that. But what I thought was really, really notable was what came out of the failure of that study really undermined the hypothesis that was really attributable for the original approval of eteplirsen. What do I mean by that? So the basis for the drug's approval was that it was going to increase expression. And therefore, the increased expression was going to translate into improved function for the patients. And the data at the time wasn't really there to support that. And I think that's why the AdCom dismissed it. Mm-hmm. What was really interesting and what's notable was it was really, in my view, there was a groundswell of patient community advocacy support that really, really got behind the drug. Mm. And it was more about hope, promise, and trying to have some sort of therapeutic alternative for these children in need of therapy.
Yeah, that emotional momentum that you referenced earlier.
Yeah. I viewed it as completely emotional, but I think it was also detached from really any clinical relevance at the end of the day. And I think it's often viewed as it was always viewed as controversial, also viewed as somewhat historical as well. And the fact that this new study kind of undermined that hypothesis, I think kind of weakens, the decision, arguably weakens the decision and the logic that supported that in the first place. Mm-hmm. So that's why I thought it was a profound, given that we're now looking at another potential approval that I think is that falls into that emotional call at the end of the day. It also falls into what is arguably a huge, huge financial opportunity as well. It's a lot different than a niche indication, I think, for that primarily impacts children. This is something that I think we all can speak to and have personal experiences to. So it's a big opportunity. It's a big play, a lot of emotion. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether or not the FDA views what happened with the Sarepta product as a precedent or whether or not, because that, arguably with hindsight, that decision doesn't look as sound as it, I'm not sure if it ever looked sound, but that decision looks less sound than ever, whether or not they would necessarily consider doing the same thing again.
Yeah. You're really good. Your experience lends to your talent, your ability to kind of level set with biopharma executives. So let's put this in that perspective for a minute. If I'm let's say I'm a biopharma CEO who has a candidate at phase 3. I've got some good data. I feel like things are going well, heading towards an approval, working towards an approval, I should say. What does a story like the Sarepta story, what should that tell me? What should that result in terms of me as the leader of this biopharma that's working toward that goal? How should it sort of inform my mindset, if you will? Should I be, looking at that precedent as something that's dangerous? Should I be looking at it as, maybe I'm looking at it opportunistically? I don't know. You tell me. What should I take away?
It's a fair point you raise. What is the lesson learned? What is the takeaway? And how can I manage my environment to avoid a similar outcome? And
yeah, you just asked yourself the question far more eloquently than I did.
If I was to reflect on this, it's to be aware of who you're dealing with, right? Forewarned is forearmed. And I think if you understand that the environment is fluid, I think that's one thing. I think absent good data, I think this is all relevant when you don't have compelling data and you don't hit your clinical endpoints and you're doing ad hoc post hoc clinical analysis. I think that's when you get into the areas that you need to kind of play other cards to get your drug approved. And there's never really been a precedent for that. Yeah. So, I would start with making sure your program, your studies are very well designed. When applicable, I think try to build adaptive aspects into them so you can roll and save time in terms of leveraging your studies. But I think you do want to make sure, and I think in terms of how you enroll your patients, how you screen your patients, how you enrich your studies, these all are helpful in terms of informing outcomes, and also take an informed, gated approach to your development efforts, so that you're not putting too much money at risk until you've proven your science to the next step. So, to me, taking an informed, gated approach, generating data that's based on well-informed and designed studies, as well as engagement with the FDA along the process, I think are critical factors for success. I would say, candidly, there's two ways to approach life, and you can apply it here. You can either let external factors manage you, or you can manage the external factors to the best of your ability. Mm-hmm. And I think when you get yourself into a situation when you're relying on emotion and patient advocacy, you've handed over the keys to somebody else to drive your car. Yeah. So my advice is to manage the development of your assets and ensure that you're managing the input of the referees, as you put it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's sound advice. I would expect that's exactly the advice I would expect from you.
Thank you.
Yeah, a bit. It's smart, conservative, cautious, rooted in science and fact.
Absolutely. You gotta follow the science. I mean, yeah. And I think it's important too that you want to kill the experiments quickly too. I think it's more common than not. Is that people kind of have their hypothesis and they stubbornly keep pursuing their hypothesis. And I can give you an example in a second, which I think is on point. And they constantly are pushing a square peg in a round hole. Mm-hmm. And I think you got to be intellectually honest, and time's the enemy, and you got to run the killer experiments, and move on and focus on things that are impactful. Otherwise, it's I guess it's all about you maintaining your job if you're doing anything other than that, and that's not going to last for long if you're not focused on the fundamentals. And I think in terms of following the science and trying to force a a square peg in a round hole. Probably my favorite example of that is actually Alzheimer's disease.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a couple of different disease indications that have that can compete for the Olympics in the number of tombstones related to drug development failures. Glioblastoma is certainly one of them. Alzheimer's, another one.
Mm-hmm.
The list goes on. But to me, Alzheimer is the classical example of that, and it's controversial. But if you think about what Lilly's doing now and that, what Biogen's antibody is going to be doing, it's still focusing on the old Alzheimer hypothesis that amyloid plaque is the driver behind Alzheimer's disease. And given all the clinical failures, I certainly, from my non-scientific background, I believe that hypothesis is completely debunked. Anybody who pitches me an amyloid plaque hypothesis, if I see them walking down the street, I go to the other side. I don't buy it anymore. And I think it speaks to the fact that we just don't understand the disease enough. And if people are debating whether or not amyloid plaque is part of the cause, we don't understand the disease well. And unless you understand the disease, there's no way to drug the disease. There's no understanding of what to target. To me, we're nowhere on it. But going back to the hypothesis of the square peg in the round hole, there's a lot of people at NIH that have PhDs that know nothing but amyloid plaque. Hypothesis. And that's what's been propagated and constantly pushed for the last 20 years. If once you move away from amyloid plaque, most of these folks are probably not even qualified to be a house painter. But that's what they're pushing, and that's what they know.
Yeah. What's the what's the saying about you give somebody a hammer and everything looks like a nail? How's that saying go? Come on, you're good at these things.
Well, in terms of, maybe it's the analogy you use. And my wife likes to say I have two tools, a telephone and a credit card.
Oh, so let's we again, our conversations seem like they're here and gone in a minute, but we're running short on time here. So I want to kind of wrap things up. If you look at the progressive trends of the FDA of late, do you see a continuation? I mean, do you think this is something we'll continue to see? What do you anticipate kind of near and midterm?
I think the shorter answer is definitely yes.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be interesting to see who the Biden administration puts into the seat at the FDA, and whether or not it'll be as progressive as what Scott Gottlieb was trying to initiate. I certainly hope so. I think that there's a lot that still needs to be done, particularly when you take a step back on a macro level. I think the FDA can go a long way to really, really helping us squeeze out a lot of costs in drug development, bring products to market a lot quicker. And that really helps solve the bigger overriding issue in terms of healthcare spend. Yeah. We need to drive that down. The system isn't going to work, and pharma isn't the bad guys, but we all have to work together to be able to make this effective. Because, I totally get that you want to totally make sure things are safe and protect people. But I think there's a balance in terms of how far you go. And I think, again, what we're doing from an approach goes back decades. And I think, the science has changed, technology has changed. And I think there's a lot more efficient ways that we can compress that and make sure that resources are being focused on all the indications and disease types that focus. When you're focusing on cancer and you're focusing on oncology, orphan diseases, when you think about the world population, I'm afraid that we're not taking it on as broadly as we should.
Yeah. Any concluding thoughts, Allan, on things that we discussed that maybe I didn't ask you the right question, or you want to drill down a little deeper into?
I think we bounced around on a lot of different things. I'm looking forward to early March to see how the FDA rules on this. I think it's going to be somewhat insightful in terms of, answering the question you had in terms of where are they?
Yeah.
Is there likely to be a little bit of a pendulum swing, maybe, but I don't think it's going to be one size fits all. I think, as I touched on, I think they're going to see things a little bit differently in terms of the modalities, and should rightfully adjust accordingly. Other than that, I think we covered a lot of things. I think it's certainly a great time to be in biotech. I think the theme that I got out of JP Morgan from talking to folks is while it's been a challenging time for the world, it's hard to imagine biotech being any better. And I think we've had our place in terms of trying to help solve the pandemic. And I think people are starting to realize that biotech is no longer a backwater segment anymore, and it's becoming incredibly mainstream. And even calling it biotech is, I think, a misnomer, because everyone's adopting RNAi. People got antibodies. Everybody's, I guess, either everybody's a biotech or we're all biopharmaceutical. But, the pharmaceutical industry should rename themselves because we're all biotech at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, I like it. Yeah, I like it, and I agree. It's a super spot to be in right now, and we'll be keeping an eye on those upcoming FDA actions, and I'm sure you and I will have opportunities to reflect on them as we get together in the coming months on the podcast. So.
I'm looking forward to it. The year is off to a good start, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the journey. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
Yep. As am I. Well, sounds good, Allan. Thanks as always for joining us, and we'll talk with you again soon.
Looking forward to it. You take care. Until next time.
All right.
To be continued.
Yep. Until next time, that's Allan Shaw. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online in partnership with Cytiva, an organization that's wholly committed to helping new and emerging biotechs navigate the ever-shifting regulatory waters that Allan and I discussed today. Check out the depth of Cytiva's resources at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. And if you're enjoying this podcast, give us 5 stars, subscribe to it, and then go to bioprocessonline.com and sign up for my newsletter there. In the meantime, thanks for listening.